I feel like I was lied to about the nature of reality. I feel like I was indoctrinated with this sort of set of beliefs, and I feel betrayed by it. And the response of some of these individuals was like, well, good. I'm glad you were. I felt a lot of anger about that.
We aspire to become awakened beings, to live in harmony with the truth of life.
From Vast Noodle Media, I'm Trent Bell. This is Knowing and Believing, a podcast about how we believe. Welcome back to Knowing and Believing. I am your host, and we're back with Taylor Lange. And in the previous episode, if you want to go back and watch it, if you haven't, we heard Taylor's deconstruction journey that ended at where we left it. It ended at a very dark place for him. He's in a good place now. He's here with us. But now we're going back and reviewing the story and going to look at it through more of a scientific evolutionary theory and everything else approach. I think we should start out with, we've got 8 different terms here that pack a lot of meaning or a lot of explanation into each term.
Okay.
And it's odd to me to learn these type of terms.
Yep.
Makes me understand things so much more and identify them.
Yep.
And be able to put them in a place of understanding, oddly, and move on for some reason. It's weird. But some of these go back to that Hidden Brain episode, Creating God.
Yep.
That when I heard them, I was like, oh my goodness, there it is. And kind of like the experience you had with the rabbi sharing his speech and then coming up short on some answers that was very detrimental it was very eye-opening but not comfortable for a long time for you.
Right.
Hearing some of these terms did the same thing. They put words to an itch that I had mentally had for a long time.
Gotcha.
And it's like, oh, okay, So a couple of these, the first 4, I think, are words that you had brought to the table.
Okay.
That I'll let you take. The first one is multi-level selection theory.
So multi-level selection theory is kind of a fancy word for usually when you say it, you're really talking about something called group selection.
Okay.
And so breaking down, if you break down the biological hierarchy, what we call the biological hierarchy, it's all the different levels that life exists at. So you have the genes.
Okay.
Genes are kind of, modern biogenesis, or the study of how life began. Modern theories that I think have most clout say that it all started with a series of self-sustaining chemical reactions that kind of look something like genes. So genes are competing with other genes to be in a genome and have the ability to reproduce. And those genes produce cells. And those cells are competing for resources. And
so genes are competing at the gene level.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to talk about in conceptual everyday language, but it's the way we view it is that a gene is trying to, any particular slice of DNA is attempting to get in the genetic code and be replicated, no matter what. Yeah. So it's what's called the gene's eye view of evolution. It's that genes are just trying to be
They're
in the
just
general
trying to get
population.
on the bus. And
exactly.
there's other genes in there like, no,
Right.
get off the bus.
Yeah.
Wow.
So then you have the cells that these genes produce.
Yep.
And we also have the individuals that these cells make up,
Right.
if you're a multicellular organism like we are. And also...
or tapeworms.
Yep. And also, evolution occurs at the level of groups of individuals.
Right.
So you have, in any sort of social species, particularly humans, this shows up pretty well. But you can look at how evolution is moving at the level of the individual and at the level between groups, and you can parse out which kind of evolutionary pressures are driving the total genetic makeup of the population. So in groups of humans, a good example is a group, 2 or 3 groups of humans are trying to compete for some sort of resource. And watering hole is a great example. And these groups, if you have 1 or 2 groups that really see themselves as a functional whole, they see each other as, even if they're not genetically related, they see themselves as brothers and sisters, and they have, they're patriotic, they're cooperative, and they function very well as a whole, and they're competing against a group that really everyone's all out for themselves,
right?
And doesn't really care about anybody else. The group that's cooperative is going to succeed,
right,
over the group that's not cooperative.
So Sapien addresses this book. Sapien addresses this, and the idea of story or narrative or vision is one of the developments that had made Sapiens specifically rise to the top.
Yep,
is his argument, or
that's a
pretty broad argument that he put in a book.
Yep, that's a common thread
right.
amongst any sort of cultural evolutionary anthropologist.
And so the odd thing for me is that I do not function in group settings. So I'm this like genetic abnormality, or like, how do I fit in? It's weird to think that a tribe of Trents back whenever fighting over a watering hole, I would have just snuck in when no one was looking and gotten the water I needed and snuck out by myself.
Yeah, it's what we call it. Yeah.
But the tribes that succeed and proliferate, they do it as a tribe and a group, and they have a common vision, and they work together. And I'm like, I don't want to work with you guys. But yet those genes of millennia have snuck through and created the guy who doesn't like to play basketball or go to church, or
right. Yeah, we have a large, there's a large human distribution or there's a large distribution of personality types and personality traits that emerge, and what you referred to as going in and stealing the water, that's referred to in the literature as the free rider problem, where you have an individual who's benefiting from,
I call it fence rider. I'm a fence rider.
Is you're benefiting from the group's collective effort while not really contributing much to it, and so that's called. In one of David's books, and really in many subsequent books, this is called the fundamental issue of social life.
Right.
How can cooperation evolve, and cooperative and pro-social tendencies evolve, when the incentive to cheat and free ride is so great? So multi-level selection and group theory, or group selection theory, is one of the ways in which we can explain the emergence and evolution of cooperative behavior. Mm-hmm. And this has been observed experimentally in, cooperation can kind of evolve 4 ways: via group selection, via a special form of group selection called kin selection, where you are cooperative towards members of your genetic kin. Right. And this is kind of a gene. This goes back to the gene's eye view of evolutionary theory, where let's say you and I are brothers, and we both have kids. Well, those kids have approximately 25% of each of our DNA as well, and so in helping. Like, if I'm going to help you raise a kid that you might not otherwise be able to raise on your own, then I am still helping to propagate my genes.
Gotcha.
So I'm cooperating with you, and I'm cooperating with your children, and thus a cooperative behavior is evolving in order to advance your own specific lineage. You can do it through reciprocity. So I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Right. And generally, if you start out with a strategy in any sort of conundrum, cooperating, and then just do whatever the other person does. In computer game or game theoretic situations, reciprocity always wins out. And since when reciprocators cooperate with other reciprocators, they're cooperating,
Right.
since they both start out with cooperation, and their average payouts across multiple games tends to be higher on average than groups
Right.
like, dyadic groups. And these are games that are played
And
between
religion
dyads.
encourages that
Yeah,
kind
and
of
so
cooperation to a large degree.
Yeah. So religion is an example of the fourth way cooperation can be sustained and evolve, and that's this is pretty much just exclusive to humans, because of the way we think with symbols, and because we have culture. We evolve institutions that kind of delineate barriers between who's in the group and who's outside of the group, and how you're supposed to act, and how you're supposed to monitor the actions of individuals within your group. And
Now, I mean, like horses and chimpanzees, I know they do stuff like that.
Yep.
They horses will push other horses out that are behaving badly and stuff.
right.
So, but this fourth level of cooperation, you're saying humans only do? Which one?
Yeah. So this is this is a result of us being able to think symbolically, and be able to like actually write down rules. So an example of the example you used with horses is an example of a learned behavior that doesn't have any sort of abstract thinking involved.
Mm-hmm.
So a mother, a mare might rear her child in a certain way, with a certain way towards cooperating or not. I don't actually know if horses cooperate that much.
They do.
I don't know much. I don't know much on
wife
how
does.
they're. So that's an example of a behavioral inheritance, rather than a symbol inheritance.
Okay.
So where you have like for example, that we know of, horses don't have any sort of example of something like the Bible that has explicit rules about, if you do this, then this is going to happen to you,
Right.
and so on and so forth. So that religion has often been invoked as a way of institutionalizing cooperation, and
Okay.
you know,
And this fourth level is called what? This
group
time?
selection.
But in this group selection, like that we do through symbols and stuff, that's called group selection? Or?
No, so group selection just refers to any sort of competition amongst groups of any species.
Okay.
Usually, or human. It's the empirical evidence thus far points to it was a major factor in the evolution of culture and the evolution of prosociality in humans. But it also happens in other species. Water striders, I think there are examples of it in, like, even all the way down at a small, like, preferential breeding group. They separate into preferential breeding groups. Some males are kind of docile with their mating, and other ones are extremely forceful. And when the docile males are able to separate and the females go towards them, the aggressive males, they try to mate so much that it can decrease the female's ability to have access to food. And so those groups tend to die off a little bit more. And the more docile males tend to flourish. And that's an example of group selection of water striders.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 2, symbolic meaning systems.
Yeah. So this is a good segue from that.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like number 4 that you were talking
Yeah.
about.
So humans have this other inheritance system that we call culture, and culture is a way of is a set of behaviors, ideas, beliefs, axioms that inform how we think about reality. And a symbolic meaning system refers to that certain subset of ideas, beliefs, axioms, etc., that that inform how you view the world. So symbolic meaning systems can be religious, and often are religious. Many symbolic meaning systems are religious. Christianity is just one example, and some of them can be secular. And
like Buddhism would be considered secular, right?
I think a little bit, because Buddhism doesn't directly invoke a god. It's particularly agnostic about it. You could.
Humanism would be the prime example.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be a pretty good example of a.
If it were a hue, Buddhism would be between maybe humanism and Christianity, or whatever, just as on the spiritual level.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's what a symbolic meaning system is. It's just a way of, and this symbolic meaning system is an inherited quality. Each individual human does not make this symbolic meaning system in
they
themselves.
add to it, they detract from it, they
Right.
refine it, and then they pass it on.
But generally, it's inherited from those around you. So it's inherited from your parents.
Right.
It's inherited from your extended family. It's inherited from your church.
Sure.
So it's a way of viewing and understanding how reality works to motivate your behavior.
Right. It's a materialist name for religion, basically. It's like, oh, that's your what material or what symbolic meaning system are you part of?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. Oh. Interesting. Okay. Proximate causation and ultimate causation.
Okay, so
I have in my mind like an idea what these mean, but I'm not sure yet.
So proximate causation is like the way I like to think of it is, what is the immediate thing that's causing a behavior or causing a trait to be expressed, and what is the ultimate, like what's the backstory is what ultimate causation is. So the example that I like to use is I'm a pretty big fan of cookies and cream ice cream. And when I go to the freezer, pull out the carton and scoop a bowl and eat it, I'm doing that. The proximate reason that I'm doing that is because it tastes great, and I really just want that sugar rush, and I want that hit of dopamine that it's going to give me. Before I might not know that that's a hit of dopamine, and I might not care.
But it just feels good.
But subjectively, it's amazing.
That's your proximate causation.
Yeah.
Right.
The ultimate causation has to do with the composition of the ice cream.
Right.
The ice cream has a lot of sugar and it has a lot of fat. And we as a species are drawn to foods that have a lot of sugar and a lot of fat because they have a lot of energy.
Right.
So when our ancestors were, growing up on the plains of Africa, they're looking for honey and they're looking to kill something fat.
Right.
And that's going to feed you for a while, and it's going to sustain you for a while. It's going to sustain your brain function. It's going to sustain all your bodily functions for a while because there's a ton of energy in them.
Right. And so over a few million years probably, we're reinforced like honey, fat, honey, fat, honey, fat.
Yep.
And then we perfected it in cookies and cream.
Exactly.
We're like, this is great. I don't have to chase anything.
Yes.
But then we don't chase anything afterwards, and then we're like, oh.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, ultimate proximate causation, ultimate causation. I got that. Okay, so functional opacity.
So functional opacity ties in directly with proximate and ultimate causation.
Right.
You do something, and you don't really know why you do it.
Right.
Like, before knowing the science behind the drive for sugar and fat,
right?
These are
was very, very similar.
Yeah, they're essentially a word for,
it's kind of like a cover term.
Yeah.
For proximate and ultimate causation.
Yeah. So so I didn't, until And I don't really think about the ultimate cause behind why I'm eating cookies and cream unless I'm feeling particularly philosophical at the time.
Right.
I just want to eat that. And so I'm eating that. I'm eating that bowl of ice cream, and I don't really know why. The only reason I know why I'm doing it is because it feels great. Not really thinking about why it feels great. It feels great because it's hitting our reward centers that evolution has primed us to have to seek out sugar and fat.
See, an interesting thing to me is like you think of like, all right, honey and fat and the amount of energy it took to get those, you know, back on the plains, and it balanced out. And then we refine it down to like, you know, dairy and sugar. We've refined it a little further, and we're like, you know, all right, but just once in a while, you know, let's not go overboard. Where the, you know, the heroin addict is just like, I just want the dopamine. They're just like straight to dopamine. You know, it's kind of like, it's a weird refining process. Like in its raw natural state, it had a natural balance to it where you had to, you know, you had to fight off the bees and get the stuff and chase down the thing and get the fat. And like that caloric intake in that cycle was appropriate.
Right.
And now we're at our medium here, you know, and we're you know, consuming cookies and cream with sugar in it, and some of us go way overboard.
Exactly.
And you know, and it's funny, like the same reason that people eat cookies and cream are the same reason that someone would shoot up heroin. It just feels good, you know, essentially. If they're talking about the most proximate cause, like it just feels good. And I saw something recently that was like the only reason anyone does anything is because of it boils down to like these two chemicals of dopamine and serotonin. Yeah, I forget how it was put together.
There's a couple more neurotransmitters involved. Oxytocin is one that is involved with love and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of wild how a few chemicals can
really motivate
the entire experience that you have.
And so functional opacity is basically a way of looking at it, of saying, all right, you know, you as a heterosexual male, you might see hips and large breasts and say, I just like those. But the ultimate causation of those, you know, is like the good birthing hips and they can feed the kids, is like the kind of deeper level of that.
Yeah, kind of on the surface level, that those are, you know, evolutionary psychology behind mating is kind of is like a huge part of evolutionary psychology as of right now, and so we're not 100% sure why. Like we have that's a generally accepted evolutionary theory in terms of male mate choice, but you know, it's a whole cacophony of other things.
Right. It kind of ties in
that are both conscious and unconscious.
Right. Like you can put a wooden egg in a robin's nest and paint it a more appealing shade of blue or whatever, and they'll ignore their own egg and they'll go with that.
Right.
And I remember hearing that on some show, and I was just like, that's stupid. But then, you know, like how we do makeup with the red lips and rouge, that is a marker of sexual activation. And it's just the you know, the red cheeks and the lips being more red. It's just blood being activated to those areas. And we're basically painting the robin shell egg a little bit more blue, and we're attracted to that. And it's weird. It's kind of like, I always want to hear David Attenborough do one of his things, but instead of like nature, it's like humans. And it's the next thing that, or one of the ones here, costly signaling.
Yeah.
To me, it's like, you know, a man might think that he's got to go out and get like a couple rings and a really expensive car and really nice clothes to attract a mate.
Right.
You know, and on a human level, those things cost him a lot of money.
Right.
It makes it he has to work more to get those, or take more risks to get those.
That's definitely a costly signal.
You know, but what's the reason he's doing it? You know, is like, I pull so many chicks with this. But like, for, you know, it's no different than the male peacock having all these feathers for what? You know?
It's a similar type of signal.
I've got to make that that show. It's just
Yeah. Yeah. So with costly signaling, it works, but it works with more than just mating.
right.
Costly signaling, what I'm doing. So the definition of a costly signal is a display to convey some sort of message about your intentions, whatever it may be.
Or abilities?
Yeah, even and abilities is
Because the feathers with a peacock make him that much more visible to tigers or whatever,
right,
and harder for him to get away,
right.
but gets him a mate.
Yes. So yeah, so that's and so the idea is that it costs. You put a lot of energy into it. You put a lot of time. You have to, in the case of the peacock, you have to eat a lot to get those
Right.
feathers nice and fluffed. And for me, I think of just kind of examining my own life from this perspective, what I'm doing in getting my PhD, while I'm doing it for experience in research, and I'm getting an education, and it's also a job, but it's for 4 to 5 years of my life that I'm investing for the credential to say that I am an expert in this field.
Right.
So I can signal so that when I can say, "Oh, my name is Dr. Taylor Lange,"
Yeah.
that someone automatically thinks, "Oh, wow, you know something about something, and
Right.
you know a lot more than me about
Right.
that something."
So it's a human level comparison to peacocks.
Yeah.
Because what is their meaning and what is their purpose? Well, they're doing that with their feathers and everything.
Right.
And at your level of existence, you're contributing to the meaning of your value system.
Yep.
By putting yourself through these very difficult things, very costly things,
Right.
and everything else. But, in the end, you'll attract someone that's like-minded, that appreciates those things, and you'll make more of you guys, and they'll go out into the world and hopefully have similar values and similar conscientiousness and everything else. And yeah, that's interesting. I always use the example. It's interesting. Like my parents, they can spot in using the peacock to PhD comparison, they're similar, but they're different. Like my parents could spot fake hubcaps on a car,
Right.
or fake chrome trim. They'd never do that, but they would put vinyl siding on their house. It's the same thing. It's just at a next economic level,
Right.
And they sent me to architecture school, and I come home and I'm like, what did you guys do? This is plastic embossed wood grain on a
Right.
and it's just it's interesting. And it leads to the next completely made up term of mine that I don't know if it applies to anything, but I call it study, lose, wonder effect.
Okay. Let's hear it.
And we'll have to go back. No, wait. We skipped dual inheritance theory, but we'll go out of that. So the study, lose, wonder effect, right?
Okay.
I heard an interview with, I think it was Cuba Gooding Jr., and he was talking to the interviewer about how it's hard for him to be present in life because as an actor, he's observing the person he's with to study their reactions, emotions, and conveyance of their emotions so he can package them into his toolbox and use them later. So he's disassociated with human interaction because he's studying it. Because I went to architecture school, I appreciate way less architecture, right? It's only now the stuff that's really nice that I look at and I'm like, wow, that's nice, right? I see, any standard, normal, great house that 90% of the population would think is great. And I'm like, well, you did this wrong and that wrong. And this is maybe anyone else is going to go to that house and experience wonder. And I'm only going to go and see I'm going to complain, right? What were the other ones? When I used to record music just on my laptop, and I'd get really involved in trying to figure out and all the sounds and get it all right. And I found that I enjoyed other people's music less, or I was less able to be present in that music and be emotionally moved by it because I was listening to it to see how they had recorded it and what they had done and everything else. It distanced me from the experience of it, right? And what was the other one? Well, for me now, religion, like the ultimate meaning is what religion is historically tried to deal with. For me, to pull it apart and study it and to really look at it and critique different parts of it, I've lost the wonder of it, right? And I've lost the ability to be in awe, of it anymore. So it's a weird thing. Like don't study it because then you won't want to worship it anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
I know what I know what you're saying. And it's interesting because there are a couple of correlates in my own life similar to that. Immediately once I started playing guitar, I started studying other guitar players and seeing how they were writing their music, how they were what they were doing, what the lead guitarist was doing. And I was really enamored by it and trying to look at it, trying to figure out what's that chord he's playing? What's that lick he's playing? What's that note? And my Uncle Eddie put it to me this way. It was like music is both a gift and a curse. You're able to create music. You're able to, if you're able to create music, you're able to listen to it on a whole nother level. But at the same time, you're still critiquing a little bit. You're still like, if someone's like playing ridiculous guitar and trying to pass it off as it's not ridiculous guitar,
right?
I immediately get disinterested. But at the same time, I've still been able to retain the wonder of the greatest innovators. I still get goosebumps listening to Jimi Hendrix play Voodoo Child.
Right.
And I've been playing guitar for 8 years and I still can't lose that, or haven't lost that yet.
Right.
And I have a similar thing with religion. With Christianity, it's a little bit harder to justify, but in approaching any subject as a student and in a scientific way and trying to figure out, you can lose a little bit of the mystery behind it and a little bit of the awe. But when it comes down to it, I'm always fascinated. I'm never not amazed by a new culture's beliefs. I'm never, and I always want to, I want to look at the proximate and ultimate causes behind why they're doing something.
Right.
But when someone's doing a behavior that I've never seen before and doing a practice that I've never seen before, I've been like, wow, this is a beautiful thing. Like this is, this went through however many hundreds or thousands of iterations until this practice got to just this point. And it's fascinating. I'm fascinated and in awe at the breadth and depth that culture really reaches in the human experience.
See, I think that your perspective coming from evolutionary study allows you to see that as beautiful. Whereas I think from a very literal, certainty-based, conservative Christian point of view, you could come at it potentially as like, well, they're just doing it wrong.
Yeah.
They're just doing it wrong.
Yep.
We know, we have the answers to everything.
Yep.
We have the truth. They're just simply wrong. But when you're coming at it from that perspective, your evolutionary study perspective, it's far more like, whoa, look what they're doing. How did they get there?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That's pretty cool. So dual inheritance theory.
Dual inheritance theory refers to human evolution as we inherit our genes and we inherit our culture.
Right.
That's pretty much all it means.
And they talk to each other back and forth and inform and change each other.
Exactly. So the main tenets of it, a guy named Joe Heinrich and Richard McElraith wrote a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, and that's not the only thing they've written. They've written many more things. This is just like a niche definition in a handbook. But dual inheritance theory basically says we have the cognitive, psychological, and neurological hardware to inherit, interpret, and innovate on culture.
Mm-hmm.
Culture itself, as a system of symbols, changes and evolves.
Right.
And that evolution of culture also informs the evolution of the genes of humans. And so there we have a couple of different examples of this. And this comes out of, I don't know what the exact study is, but a recent study came out of a group, a tribe in somewhere in Southeast Asia, I think, and this culture relies very heavily on diving and for fish, and they did some genetic testing on them. They did some gene mapping, and what they found was these people are able to dive at extraordinarily low depths for very long, like 7 or 8 minutes. I think it's 7 or 8 minutes. I'm not exactly 100% sure how long it is, but much longer than you or I
your
could.
Standard American.
Exactly. And what they found was there's a mutation in this particular tribe in that codes for something in your spleen that allows them to retain oxygen for longer in their blood and use it a little bit more efficiently. And so they're not having the reflex of needing to breathe faster because the way your breathing works is your I believe it's your hypothalamus is constantly taking measurements of the oxygen and everything in your blood. And then it's giving you, and this is a completely unconscious function. Like you can consciously kind of, have some influence on how your breath moves and stuff, but it's like almost impossible to stop the breathing reflex.
Right.
And in some cases, I believe people have done it, but then they pass out and then they breathe again. So the reflex is informed by the oxygen concentration in your blood.
Right.
And so I believe the pathway is that oxygen stored in the spleen is being released a little bit slower and still informing the hypothalamus that you don't need to breathe yet, you don't need to breathe yet, you don't need to breathe yet, you don't need to breathe yet. And you actually don't because you have enough energy in your bloodstream. Right. And then you go back up 7 minutes later with a fish. So the culture of using fish as a main food source, like that cultural inheritance, that cultural / behavioral inheritance of this is how we eat, this is how we prepare this food, this is our staple sustenance, has led to a genetic alteration.
Now, they think that the behavior came first, or is it a chicken and egg thing? Did the behavior of fishing come first, and like the guys that could, or the women, whoever was diving that could hold their breath longer, got more fish, got more ladies, produced more babies, and there was just more of those? Or was it like, oh guys, look at this, we can hold our breath for a long time?
That's a good point in trying to identify causal evolutionary changes, because you have to be able to take temporal assessments. But you can also look at other cultures around them, because there will be a similar genetic lineage, and you can look at how they're getting their sustenance.
Oh, okay.
And so you can, if you're looking at genetically similar cultures, and this one happens to be, fishing a lot more, natural selection would have favored this kind of a trait.
Sure.
And it's entirely possible that, evolution doesn't, that mutation doesn't happen overnight. So it keeps progressively getting better. Your spleen gets progressively better, and you're also able to dive longer. even at the onset of the mutation, which is then allowing you to dive deeper for longer, get more fish. And so it's just this constant feedback loop. So it's kind of hard to determine exactly when the practice started and when the mutation occurred, but they appear to co-evolve in tandem.
Interesting. Yeah, being a surfer that's put himself in some bad situations, I've had to fight against the breathing reflex more than I'd like to sometimes.
Right.
All right, so those are some densely packed terms to then look at academically look at your story and the things that were going on there.
Right.
So your early story has mostly to do with kind of an indoctrination experience. And my take on that, for me, I see a lot of it, like personally, in reflecting my story with yours, I see a lot of imprinting more than indoctrination, because I think I function less within a group and more within an immediate family unit, tighter group of friends. So I feel like I was more imprinted with spirituality, and I don't know that I can ever know now for sure, is there a God or isn't? Am I just feeling emotions, or is there a supernatural tickling my, whatever,
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of knowing that anymore, because I was imprinted with the idea of a God. Whereas if I were raised atheist and came to this point and then heard about all this and then kind of made a decision to go there, it's a different situation.
Yeah. So imprinting and indoctrination are essentially the same process with a little bit of different meaning.
Right.
So in both cases, you are inheriting a symbolic meaning system.
Right.
You're inheriting from the church, from your parents, from whoever is involved in the imprinting / indoctrination process, how to view the world, how to behave in the world, how to be a part of this group, and how to be separate from that group. Indoctrination usually has a connotation, it has like an insidious connotation to it.
Yeah.
And it's often understood as, someone is consciously and intentionally trying to imprint you with a certain meaning system with the explicit effect of trying to control you. And that's usually the connotation that it gets. And when you say the word indoctrination, it conjures up those sorts of feelings. But, I see there are some cases of indoctrination and imprinting where it is absolutely 100% insidious. I'm never going to say that those cases don't exist. But any individual who is born into this world is going to get imprinted with its culture's teachings.
Imprinted and indoctrinated with culture, religion, spirituality, whatever. Yeah.
Hands down, it's always going to happen. This is a natural process that always happens. We are constantly learning from those around us and from the symbols that the greater culture teaches. So I had a negative view of indoctrination, and this led to another fallout with some folks in my church later on towards my graduate degree, when I started learning about indoctrination and especially with that insidious connotation. There was a little bit of a confrontation in which I was, I kind of, I feel like I was lied to about the nature of reality. I feel like I was indoctrinated with this sort of set of beliefs, and I feel kind of betrayed by it. And the response of some of these individuals was like, well, good. I'm glad you were. And so I felt a lot of anger about that. But let me try to unpack that interaction psychologically. This is taking my own interpretation of how interactions that I've had in terms of somebody that I know violating social norms that I think shouldn't be violated. Mm-hmm. And so when when you take an issue like reproduction, like this, or alcohol or partying or something like that, a norm that's generally warned against in religious settings, the presumed fallout of taking those actions is pretty set out. Like, you are being ensnared by Satan in this context, and your life is falling out, and you are falling out of God's graces.
Right.
And to a person who's on that inside perspective, who also deeply cares for the violator of that norm, their only response, their only reasonable and logical response, according to the meaning system that they adhere to, is to rebuke them and try to get them to repent.
Right, to come back within the lines of the symbolic meaning system.
Yes.
And adhere to what they think is the ultimate causation.
Right.
But most likely, is proximate causation.
Right. So you're thinking that you're being, ultimately, premarital sex is warned against. It's not like, some people say it's expressly forbidden. Other people say that's a little bit of gray area. And a lot of theology around it goes around Paul's professions about marriage, and I think Jesus's teachings on divorce are often invoked in this as well. And so those practices have endured either as like they've just kind of come with the culture, or at one point they actually had some sort of benefit to that culture.
Right.
Keeping dating within the faith, getting married so that you're not being super promiscuous. Those have very solid group-based adaptive functions.
And I think to some degree, obviously, individual, like if you're over promiscuous, disease can spread
Absolutely.
more easily. There's a lot of merit and a lot of benefit to a lot of the teachings on sex by a lot of the religious institutions, but they strip away, they take symbolic meaning system, make it ultimate causation, and it ends there.
Yeah.
No questioning that, no discussing that. It seems like you could, even within a church, say, we believe there's a God, and we believe Jesus was his son, and here's some things that he said, and here's what the science says.
Yeah.
And they're pretty close, guys. Be careful.
Yeah. So there's a lot of so when I look, for example, at the book of Leviticus has a lot.
Pretty far from science.
Yeah. Well, but it also has,
In some ways.
it has, some of those laws have very adaptive functions in a time when you don't understand germ theory.
Right.
So don't eat shellfish. Don't eat don't eat animals that have hooves, but don't chew the cud. I think that's one of the kosher prohibitions. Restrict dietary consumption. That has an adaptive function when you're when you're possibly eating something that's going to make you super sick if it's not properly prepared.
Right.
So either you can have a culture that properly prepares food, and there are plenty of cultures around that through forces of cultural evolution have been able to unpack and properly cook food that is otherwise can give you acute cyanide poisoning in the case of some South American tribes, or you can just flat out prohibit it, and see someone get deathly ill from eating a bad shellfish, and say, in an era where you don't understand germ theory, be like, you ate something that was unclean. God doesn't want us to eat these, so let's not eat them. It gets imprinted, and you're no longer dying of food poisoning. So in certain contexts, these prohibitions are highly adaptive. And then we start to understand the science a little bit more. Now, Jesus kind of threw out the dietary restrictions some say he did, some say he didn't. Paul's under the assumption that he did, I think, especially with his professions in Romans. But it's entirely possible that there were safer practices of cooking shellfish. They still don't understand germs, but they're cooking and eating shellfish, and especially with the Romans. And this is entirely possible. And you see this; they're not dying of food poisoning. Right. So throwing those out, as long as you're adhering to those proper cooking practices that you're inheriting from the Roman or the Greek or whatever other culture is around you, it's okay to eat shellfish. And then we get to eat oysters, which we all know are delicious.
It's really interesting to look at like indoctrination and religion and think about multi-level selection theory, symbolic meaning systems, proximate causation, ultimate causation, the functional opacity of all, the dual inheritance. Like I would think given enough millennia or whatever, that over time, that I wonder how genetically we would evolve adhering to a Judeo-Christianity lifestyle. Would the age of puberty, if they're truly adhering to it, would the age of puberty move into like the mid-20s maybe, or would stuff like that start to happen? Does that really apply to indoctrination and imprinting much?
Only in the sense that the indoctrination is a cultural evolutionary process, and we are, our brains are primed for it.
Right.
Our brains are primed to be social animals and to look at the practices of those around us and have an internal bias towards the most successful individuals and the individuals that our peers think are the most successful, right, and those that we also directly observe as having the most skill in some sort of area. So you could, I still have flickers from my fundamentalist days. Some of the guys in my youth group have since gone on. They're married and have kids now. I don't. I'm doing something else with my life. But there's still some sort of, deep instinctual drive to be like, man, I should probably be married and have kids by now. But at the same time, I'm like, not really. I'm not entirely sold to it. So like there's, there are inborn drives to reproduce and be a part of a group. And those are genetically driven drives. Mm-hmm. Those are our brain doesn't come hardwired to do that. It comes pre-wired to do that. Pre-wired to seek out how the world functions from those around us. And so that's what we've genetically inherited, and then we inherit this culture, this cultural meaning system. In my case, from the church, and that's the process of my indoctrination or imprinting.
Right. So an interesting thing for me is that I feel like I'm genetically not wired to go with religious flow. Like I disassociate with groups. Mm-hmm. Like if there's a lot of people visiting us, I'll step back. Like my kids have less of a relationship with me when there's a lot of people around.
Okay.
And genetically, I am primed to question and criticize what the group is doing. Mm-hmm. Like what part do I play in evolution, of evolving thought processes, belief processes, and everything else? I think I play a valuable part. I'm not saying me specifically, but people like me that are more looking at a group from the outside do play a very valuable role in gaining that different perspective.
Yep.
And start to say, you guys are doing this, but it's contradictory to this or that. And I think that's a valuable part, honestly.
So the cultural evolutionary process is shaped by innovations and is shaped by individuals' abilities to take their inherited culture, critique it, digest it, and change it.
Yeah. And
so that's the way that variation is introduced into the cultural, the population of cultural traits.
The Liturgist podcast and communities like that, discussions like this is simply part of that process.
Right.
It's not a ripping everything apart thing. But what is that? We'll get to that later. But what is that moment when you really emotionally lose that worldview, though? You know, and evolutionary. What purpose does that serve? Is that just like a alarm going off saying you're going way outside the boundaries here? You got to get back to, you know, I wonder.
So emotionally, we are we're wired as social creatures. There's been a lot of work done, in particular with neuroscience, to suggest that a person's threat sensing mechanism in their brain is assuaged by the presence of another person. Doing some, I believe it was an fMRI study. It was a gentleman named James Cohen at the University of Virginia who did a brain imaging study on women and measured their neurological baseline using an fMRI machine, and said that they were going to subject them to a slight shock in one of their hands. And he split this group of women up into 3 different groups. Groups that went through it by themselves, groups that held the hands of a stranger, and groups that held the hands of their husband. And what the fMRI showed was that the neural pathways, the parts of the brain that are responsible for responding to threats, were highly activated in anticipation of the shock. But as you moved a step forward to holding the hand of a stranger, the level of neurological activity decreased. And when the women who were holding the hands of their husbands, their threat level, the threat response decreased even more. And it was not just physiological, it was also mental. So what they did was they gave surveys to these women about what, how good would you rate your marriage? And what they found is that women that rated their marriages most strongly had a noticeable difference even within the group of those that were holding their hands with their husbands.
Interesting.
So your perceptions and your perceptions of your relationships and your perceptions of reality influence your brain's responses to threats. And this is a key part of what's called social baseline theory, is that we as humans are neurologically wired to be dependent on the group, even if that group is just so small as a family. Right. So with your, we're adapted to really only be in groups of about 50 to 150 people. Right. And then we start building these large scale societies based around agriculture. And
based around story too, is the argument of
the ability to
Sapien.
store grain or whatever agricultural produce and animal husbandry. Right. And so as we created these societies, the small system of symbols that we had already accrued as small groups exploded into larger institutions of divisions of labor, and this is termed as once we started doing this is called human ultrasociality, where we are a group of we inhabit a group of species that includes like ourselves and social insect colonies, in that we live in huge groups and divide labor up. And you have farmers and basket weavers and stuff in this huge interconnected, entirely self-sufficient society where one person has their own specific job and then they're trading between each other. Whereas ants do it a little bit differently. They're not as cognitively complex as we are, obviously, but they react very, they all have complex divisions of labor, and they're very equitable. they're like little communists, actually.
Little communists without all the devious intent and power grabbing.
Right. So like Edward Wilson, a researcher who used to be at Harvard, he famously said that Karl Marx got everything right except he got the species wrong.
Right? Like, yeah, like communism, socialism is like, as an ideal is like, yeah, perfect. But
It's hard to implement.
capitalism is so, it makes for the handicap. It makes a better accommodation for the handicap of the true reality of human nature. It's interesting. So we talked about that. Your next part of your story, going to college.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little more about the psychology of the function of rebuke and from members leaving the group. I've always wondered, a question I've had is, what's the ramification of the indoctrination, sacred, guilt, shame system of behavior control?
Yep.
So I look at, it sounds like the denomination that you were part of, as well as Seventh Adventism, does not look favorably on homosexuality.
Right.
So what they do is, as you know, is they pray the gay away, or they, if you imagine yourself as a gay boy growing up in that culture, you'd know as soon as you hit puberty that you were gay, because you're like, whoa, I'm attracted to that. But that's not what my church is into. That's not what my family's into. Your most immediate, most important relationships, your little tribe, just at its core rejects you. And so you feel the guilt, you feel the shame, you feel the disapproval, you feel the rebuke. But this is like need number one drive, as we know from growing up as males. It's like you're just exploding in your head, And imagine that, and then combine it with the environments that we grew up in.
Yeah.
You're just like, bam, 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 back and forth. Like,
Yeah.
what are you going to do? Well, you commit suicide eventually.
That's
the
a common
statistics are crazy high on that. Or you take everything that culture taught, all the good and all the bad, and you just throw it out, and you start like from ground zero of, what do I desire?
Yeah.
And that's why you have things, not this specifically, but that's why you have things like gay pride parades that, like, I'm sick of being told I'm wrong and I'm to be ashamed of this and everything else. I'm out and I'm proud. I'm over this being under your thumb.
Yep.
If we were a society where that was treated as, oh, you're gay, okay, and it had always been that way, there wouldn't be gay pride parades. There would just be Wednesday and like, hey, Tom, whatever.
Yeah.
It's a psychological reaction to being guilted and shamed. But interestingly, what I found, we did an interview with a guy out in San Francisco that moved there as a pastor to pray the gay away. And this was a practice back in the 90s, I think. And he learned from his experience living amongst these people that he came to, fix, that it didn't change them at their core. This was an unchangeable thing with them. And that every time someone would feel that they had, prayed the gay away and they could now be heterosexual, it wouldn't last long term. And over time, we've realized that this is really just damaging people, and that what they're really looking for is meaningful every human is looking for meaningful relationships, to be understood, to be loved, just like everyone else, and that these people should not be made to feel ashamed or rebuked in that way that these very conservative religions are. And he found that the people that did cast everything off, that went overboard with just like whoever, whenever, all the time, they spent the emotional energy that they had and everything else. They went too far to one extreme, and they were living, just a crazy lifestyle, that he found these people, and he found that they still wanted those more meaningful relationships, and that they would actually get to the extent of that and say, this is not fulfilling me. Mm-hmm. It's the opposite of what I grew up in. And I've acted against that, and I've proven I can still survive and not be under your thumb, but I'm not fulfilled.
Right.
And he's out there acting as a Christian minister, but a completely open and accepting congregation and everything else now, where he initially went out there to rid the whole place of that, I guess. And he's got just a really, really beautiful thing going on there, whereas primary goal is to seek to help people become whole and have healthy quality lives, but not based on any process of shame or guilt or coercion through spiritual ramifications.
Yep.
and everything else. And I found that whole process and everything else of how psychologically that works to be pretty interesting, and to see the beauty that one person was incorrectly driven to try and change people, to actually try and heal people through just accepting and loving them.
Right.
And I found that to be personally very true in my own relationships. I would, with my kids, if I rebuke them and correct them, it doesn't work as well as just simply loving them and encouraging them towards a better end. Mm-hmm. It works quicker.
Yep.
Obviously, as a parent, there's times when you're going to have to say, please stop hitting your brother. That's not right. You're going to be in timeout, whatever. Mm-hmm. But overall, I think it's an updated version of social cohesion that would work better. But
yeah, so
so you had a thing in here: define proximate and ultimate causations for the reason why behaviors continue to proliferate even when they appear to be psychologically maladapted to the parties involved.
Yeah, so being rebuked by your group sucks.
It's no fun.
It really
Sometimes
sucks.
it does need to happen, though. I mean,
right.
if Hans is killing Jews by the millions, the group needs to tell Hans that's not acceptable, right, and rebuke him.
Yeah. So, this guy named Christopher Boehm wrote a really interesting book in 2011. It's called Moral Origins: The Evolution of Virtue, Guilt, or Virtue, Altruism, and Shame, or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And shame and rebuke are super useful in keeping people in line and adhering to cooperative norms in hunter-gatherer groups.
Okay.
So he's a cultural anthropologist, and he works primarily with data sets pertaining to small-scale hunter-gatherer groups. And shame and guilt have a bit of a benefit for the group, because, on average, if you guilt someone, gossip them about them, something, shame them, they'll change their behavior. On average, that will usually happen, especially in a hunter-gatherer setting where being ostracized from the group generally means death.
Yeah, that's a pretty, yeah.
Yeah, so then you get into settings, but being guilted and shamed are successful group maintaining mechanisms because of the psychological and mental consequences of being ostracized from the group. You want to be accepted. You want to be able, and in our evolutionary past, being ostracized from the group means you no longer have access to their to their resources. You no longer have access to the ability to reproduce. And so you have almost no choice but to adhere to cultural norms, and their shame and guilt are an inborn mechanism that allows us to see people who are potentially free riding from the group and correct their behavior. Now, that has highly maladaptive qualities when you are able to when you become a bit more cognitively complex in a larger society. So, and what I mean by that is when you maintain when Christian groups maintain that cultural artifact of abstinence only, and another famous one is no birth control. You can have super maladaptive consequences for certain groups depending on the context. Abstinence only, especially in education systems in the United States when they're taught in schools, generally aren't as effective as talking about the responsibilities behind having sex and approaching sex in a more adult manner and talking to teenagers and high schoolers about it in an adult manner. But when you have, when you have a view of sex that is, well, you can have a view of sex that's spiritual without invoking religion. But when you have this view of sex as like this sanctioned behavior, like divinely sanctioned behavior between a man and a woman, as a cultural artifact of a church, it can have, and you spend and you're not going to like marry someone off when they're like 13 or 14, like when this was, like when this is happening. And the age of marriage kind of gets pushed back a little bit.
Right.
You are, during a very developmentally important stage of socialization, you're drilling into people's heads that it's not okay to have sex.
Right.
And then they get to their wedding night, and I don't, this is kind of speculative, and I'm not 100% sure on the data of it, but I've heard, so most of my experience comes anecdotally from being in communities that have had bad experiences. And I'm sure it's entirely possible that for every one good experience you have, or for every one bad experience someone has in purity culture, they have 100 more, or there could be like 10 that have good experiences.
Right.
But you can have individually maladaptive outcomes based on purity culture. And I'm an example of it. So, my views on sex have evolved over time, and I've had to, through therapy and through, meaningful relationships, I've had to work through my own mental hangups of feeling guilty. I don't really have that anymore. I think I've successfully navigated out of it.
Praise be. Do you watch
You're telling me.
Handmaid's Tale?
So there's times when guilt and shame are adaptive, and there are times when guilt and shame are not adaptive.
It seems like guilt and shame just might be more effective and useful and less damaging in smaller group settings where the consequences are higher.
Yeah. So they were very adaptive in those contexts, and sometimes though they could still be adaptive. It's hard to, if let's take a present day feminist perspective with locker room talk.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I'm in a locker room with a couple of my guy friends, and they start talking about and objectifying a female friend or this girl that they saw in the gym or something like that. It's adaptive for me to shame them for that in this current culture, because that kind of behavior propagates that kind of behavior and that kind of mentality propagates patriarchy, and it propagates male superiority, which is just another word for patriarchy, I suppose.
Yeah.
And
now, interestingly, I mean, like my previous religious culture would have agreed with feminism.
Yes.
That I should have, said something and like, guys, this is inappropriate.
Right. So shame in that circumstance, I think, is adapted for the rest of our culture, because if I'm shaming someone into changing their mentality about, how they think about women, then that's most likely going to result in better outcome, because, you know, if that person does change their mind due to this shame, which sometimes, probably most of the time, you would say that doesn't. But, you know, in the cases where it does, then that's a new cultural idea. That's a new cultural trait that another person has, and then that person can pass it on and on and on and so forth. So that's you know, we can use guilt and shame in constructive ways to disassemble harmful institutions such as patriarchy.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So
For me, I mean, shame was effective in getting me to realize that my behavior truly wasn't where it should be as far as my level of selfishness and everything else in my marriage.
right.
You know, it was extremely shameful for me to have to hear from my wife, like, you're overcritical, controlling, and selfish. No, I'm not. And then I'd go and talk to someone else and be like, yeah, you are. And I was like, that did
Right.
not feel good. And I felt that shame, and it did make me, you know, like, all right, I've got to take this seriously. I've got to be honest with myself about, and I've got to talk to Amber and see what I'm doing that's uncomfortable for her, and am I truly being overcritical here? Yep, okay. You know, and it serves some purpose, I guess. But when you're associating it with, I guess it's just a societal thing where you start to set your values and draw your lines.
Right. And I think that I need to clarify a little bit further in what I mean when I say, you know, like, I would never want to be said that I advocate using shame and guilt to do X, Y, and Z. You know, there are, you know, those are inborn psychological mechanisms that we can take advantage of to point out maladaptive behavior in a certain circumstance, but we have to be able to couple that with grace and be able to be like, okay, you're doing something wrong. This should be changed. Stop doing that behavior.
Right.
You know, and if they make earnest strides to do it, then, you know, we can introduce grace and be like, you didn't know any better. You know, you were just kind of going along with your culture. You're doing better now.
Yeah.
And
we're graduating here.
Exactly.
People. We're moving on.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So like the rebuke, particularly like right before I went to college, just to kind of answer your question a little bit more, is also that rebuke is not necessarily coming from a place of, it's not coming from a place of, I want you to get in line. I want you to do things the way I want you to do things. It's more likely that it's, especially with a relationship or a friendship that is very deep, it's coming from a place of genuine concern.
Yeah, I mean, the person that rebuked you believed that they were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And genuinely thought they were helping you get back on track, closer to the truth.
Yes. Exactly.
But it was, for you had come to a different point of what you believed.
Yep.
And so therein lies, like, your friend drew their lines in the sand, and the two of you changed, essentially. Right. And it's an inevitable thing that with these type of conservative religions, that you're probably almost perceived as a threat after that. In some,
I've definitely felt perceived as a, and this might just be my own internalization of the concepts of tribalism and how humans interact together. So, you know, and it might be just me reading too far into the behavior of some people, but I've definitely felt perceived as a threat, much in the way, like, and even internal dialogues with myself and almost like with my younger self, because you're kind of going through, you're going through all of your past beliefs to figure out where you are now. and you're having a dialogue with yourself, and it's almost like that 16-year-old kid who thinks he's going to get married at 23 is just like, it's almost like he's looking at me right now with tears in his eyes, like, that's what I become. As we've been bringing up the liturgists, one of the new hosts, Hillary McBride, put out a tweet that really resonated with me, and she said, have compassion for your younger self, because your younger self doesn't know then what you know now. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I've had to be able to be like, kid, you don't get it.
Right.
You're not going to get it until you get to be my age.
Right.
So, and just let it...
Hey, easy now. You're not that old. Because that makes me old.
I'm older than I was then.
Someone along the exact same line, someone had said, like, it's you're never going to unknow the things you now know.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like a cog railway.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, yeah, you're never going to be able to go back to that amount in that position and feel the same awe and wonder and respect again.
Yeah.
And I feel that as an adult, that I remember when I was a kid, if we'd travel somewhere, it was just like this, there was new smells, and it was just like all this stuff, and it's just like new experience, you know, and I find it so much harder to find that experience now, like to find awe and wonder anymore these days. And then I look at people that, you know, are just extremely wealthy and get paid to, like, professional surfers that travel the earth to do their sport. I mean, they go literally around the globe every year to all these different contests. I feel like you'd start to feel like the earth was so small eventually because you just see it so much and know it all. It would be weird. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying about that, and looking back at your younger self, where you're at now. But there's that grace that you have to have with yourself, and that maturity that you have to just realize that there's a new mark and awe for wonder. And for me, I've just realized that truth is just, it's like the horizon, you know, and it's always out there, and you can explore everything from here to the horizon. But as soon as you get to where the horizon was, there's all that much more truth in front of you because the horizon's moved. And to me, that ultimate truth, or absolute truth, you know, is at the horizon. And the only way to get across that horizon is death at this point, you know. And that's the ultimate thing. Like, is there anything beyond that horizon? And there's just, I wrote down a thought a couple years ago now, that life is a time of questions, and death is a time of answers, you know. And as it applies to this, that's all you got, you know. And to me, that's the awe and wonder in it. And that's why I look at science now as something that's really interesting. But science still is, you know, an objective fact has so little meaning in it. It means exactly what it means. That's it. But it's a data point that you can put with other data points to make a trajectory towards further meaning, further truth. And then you reach out beyond that line of objectivity and empirical whatever towards what you believe. Yeah. You know? And you use science, and you use belief is where you place something up there, and you use science to get close to it. And you eventually, maybe, are part of pulling that belief across the objective line eventually. Right. Which is pretty cool. And that might take 1,000,000 years to get some of those beliefs across that objective line, and science is part of that. And you might just have to accept that you're only moving that thing that's 1,000,000 miles away 1 inch closer to that objective empirical line. But, you know, that's just the time scale that we're working with. And to me, considering atheism, or the bigness of it all, and the vast amount of things that I know now, and the depth of, you know, quantum theory or physics and string theory and all of that, is just, it's just mind blowing how crazy this universe is and how little we are in it. The idea of God is so much bigger than it was before for me.
Mm-hmm.
Before, I knew all the answers, or at least I knew where to get all the answers. I just didn't want to have to go memorize them. That just seems so weird, you know? So it's, I guess what I'm saying is I'm coming to be able to find wonder again within this journey, I guess.
Yeah. So, one of the many, I think the term I'm looking for is platitudes used, is that it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Right.
So here's something that's kind of helped me a little bit is in one of the letters to the Corinthians, Paul writes a definition of faith that I used to adhere to pretty closely. Or rather fit my definition of faith and belief, is that faith is the certainty of what we don't know, or something along those
Things
lines.
hoped for.
Exactly. And I held on to that definition of faith for a while. And then I became not certain of any of the things, not seen. And so I needed to change my definition of faith. So I looked around and I started reading some, I got deeper into Buddhist thought, and I started reading Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle. And Alan Watts had a really good definition of faith that I think fits my own definition of faith a little bit better now. Is faith is not certainty, because certainty is too limiting. Faith is allowing the universe to be what it is without judging it and basking in its awe and beauty.
Right.
So the general assumption is the universe is infinitely big and infinitely small. Or rather, some theories allow for, infinity is a concept that we can't even grasp. Infinity is a numeric concept that the mind literally can't wrap itself around. But the numeric idea of infinity is that it's indivisible. You can't divide anything by infinity. And you can't divide anything by infinity without getting zero. So we have an infinite universe, and through science, we're trying to understand how it works. So if you have infinity in the denominator, assuming that the universe is infinite, we're constantly adding things to the numerator of that equation to figure out what the universe actually is. But no matter how much we add to the numerator, it's always going to be zero. Because infinity creates everything to be nothing, or makes everything nothing. Right. And it's by comparison. And then kind of getting into mathematical concepts, infinity doesn't even have one level. Infinity can be divided up into different sized infinities. So where you have, and this is just kind of a tangent, but so you have even numbers and you have odd numbers, right? And you have an infinite number of even and odd numbers. They go on, right, and on and on and on and on. But the number of even and odd numbers combined to make the counting numbers is a larger infinity than the infinity of even numbers. Yeah. And then going another step forward, you get into decimals. Right. So the number of decimals of a number can be divided infinitely. Right. And so you just have these growing sizes of infinity that, like, when I first heard that absolutely blew my mind. Right. And there are and you can keep going on and on and on. Well, actually, I think there's only like 5, but infinity itself is a mystery that inspires awe in me because I can't comprehend it.
Right.
I can't comprehend how there can be multiple sized infinities.
I got into, like, in my very uninformed way, the gobstruck wonder of infinity, like just in the last year. And also kind of the concept of zero. This is very, very weird conversation. But
it's just the absence of anything.
Yeah. And how it's just impossible. And it's interesting to me how infinity kind of comes back to zero if you try and understand it, divide it, whatever. It is really weird. And that it's interesting to me that the initial thing that's made me like keep one little pinky on the edge of the cliff holding on to supernatural belief or potential for that is just basically 0 + 0 = 0. There's something rather than nothing, you know? And I'm not associating that with like Wesleyan whatever or Seventh-day Adventist, but there's obviously something way beyond us that we just don't understand, and that's, you know, if we have to package that into an idea called God, you know, I'm fine with that. And at some level, I wish I had a machine that could just erase the part of my brain that keeps insisting that, no, I have to have literal truth to, you know?
Yeah.
Because at some point you have to embrace the wonder of what you don't know and how inspiring it is. And you have to put, to a degree, not a name on it, but you have to in some way worship it. And that's where we have religions and definitions of God and everything else. And it's human nature that distorts them into the things that we all get to the point of wanting to reject. But yeah, that idea of 0 and 0 just always going to equal 0.
Right.
Where did the laws come from that govern quarks or whatever just popping in and out of it? I mean, there's freaking laws. You know, it's just amazing. Like that's where I'm drawn towards wonder now and worship. And I hope I can get to a point of accepting some type of belief practice or whatever else to reconstruct something, which is a good segue for us to end this part of the conversation and return to where we left your story, in a very, very sterile, dark, and empty place.
Right.
So tune back in next week when we see if Taylor brings it back up into cruising altitude, which obviously he did because he's here. But thanks again for watching and listening, and we will be back next week to talk with Taylor about how he has reconstructed his life and his process of connecting to what's beyond us, believing potentially or not. We'll see. So thanks again.